So welcome back, everyone, and welcome back to our remote attendees. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Camille Robcis. Camille Robcis is professor of French and history at Columbia University. She specializes in modern European history with an emphasis on gender and sexuality, France, and intellectual, cultural, and legal history. She's the author of The Law of Kinship, Anthropology, Psychoanalysis, and the Family in France, published by Cornell University Press in 2013, and of Disalienation, Politics, Philosophy, and Radical Psychiatry in Post-War France, which was published by University of Chicago Press last year. She's currently working on a new project, which she will speak to today, tentatively titled The New Culture Wars, Geopolitics, Sovereignty, and the Global Fight Against Gender. She has received fellowships from the Penn Humanities Forum, LAPA, that's the Princeton Law and Public Affairs, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institute for Advanced Study, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. Camille's talk today is titled The Battle Around Gender at the 1995 Beijing Women's Conference. And just as a quick reminder of those of you attending virtually, we encourage you to post, as you had in the previous panel, questions to the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your window. We'll direct these to Camille as we move to the Q&A component. You also will have the ability to upvote questions that you would like to draw our attention to in the queue. And with that, I will turn it over to Camille.
Thank you so much for this introduction. I want to also start by thanking Roy and Misha and all the sponsors for inviting me today. I'm really thrilled to be here. I've already learned a lot from the previous presentations so far, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the day. So when I accepted this talk in April, I thought I would present the first chapter of this book that I'm currently writing, which is actually, the title keeps on changing, but you can tell me what you think. Is this working? It was working a second ago. Okay. Yeah, so that's the current title, Gender Panic, Populism and the Global Battle Around Sexual and Reproductive Rights, but I'm not attached to it yet. But anyway, then classes began and I was only able to write about half of this chapter, not the whole thing. So I'm still going to present what I have so far. But what it means is that it's probably less of a polished conclusion and more of a roadmap of where I want to go. So I'm especially eager to get your feedback, comments, questions, because it's very much a work in progress. And you'll see that the first half, or the part that's written, is much more solid than the second part. But here I go. So perhaps I wanted to start with just a few words situating the project and telling you basically how I got interested in this question of anti-genderism and sort of lay out the broader questions that I hope the book will answer. So I'm an intellectual historian of France, and I originally got interested in this field of anti-genderism through the case of France. So this is one example of the French protests against gay marriage in 2012, 2013. And this is another one so basically, as you can tell from these pictures, these demonstrations brought hundreds of thousands of people to the streets. Even though the bill for the mariage pour tous never even mentioned the term gender, very quickly the protesters' rhetoric and imagery circled around that term. So there was a kind of double argument that we saw throughout the protests. On the one hand, gay marriage was presented as the direct result of a mysterious theory of gender that had inspired pro-LGBT rights activists. So that was one argument. But the other argument was that if gay marriage were to pass, it would lead to this imposition of a theory of gender throughout society. So a kind of domino effect, right? So this is one example of where you saw this. A book that came out during these years, that, theory of gender would lead to same-sex marriage, which would lead to multi-parenting, which would lead to reproductive technology, which would lead to surrogacy, and the child is being crushed by the dominoes. This is another poster I like. In the French case, the link with populism is really quite palpable. All of the protesters were dressed, I didn't put any pictures of this, but they were constantly invoking symbols of the French Republic, dressed as Marianne, etc. But you see in this poster, it starts with filiation being a fiction, fabrication of children, commercialization of bodies, ideology of gender, discarded petitions, that one's more weird, police repression, fiscal persecution, and then we end with confiscated democracy. So a very kind of strong link between gender theory bringing about the demise of not only the French Republic, but democracy more generally. After the law was passed in 2013, the protests against gender continued with a particular focus on education and children. So these were some of the famous posters of the time. The one on the left is, took me a while to figure out, but you may recognize that the snail is a hermaphrodite, so hence the theory of gender. And then this one on the right saying, please leave us our gender stereotypes. Higher education was seen as the locus of production of this theory of gender, particularly with university women's studies departments. And primary school here was the locus of the indoctrination of these children imagined to be especially vulnerable and malleable. So against this idea of gender as social, cultural, changeable, activists defended sex, which was imagined to be natural, biological, and self-evident. So this, I think, goes back to some of the conversation we were having before. This biologization of sex, right? This is a poster that said, uh-oh, the image went away. One poster that said, we want sex, not gender. And then this idea, basically trying to anchor sex into nature as opposed to gender, which would be seen as cultural and social. Give me 1 second because the images, well, anyway, so the images are quite important, but hopefully they'll come back quickly. Okay, great, thank you. So as you can see here again, this poster says there are no eggs and testicles, obviously, and then I don't have to explain the one on top, but 2 men sexual organs do not make a baby. But this idea that if we ground it in something that's self-evident and natural, we wouldn't have these problems around culture that we're having with gender. So this was my kind of starting point for this project. And I was interested in better understanding what social, political, and cultural fantasies have become subsumed under this label of gender agenda, gender theory, or gender ideology. And not just in France, but in many parts of the world. So we heard about this morning, and I think we'll hear about it this afternoon. But you know, there's been from Eastern Europe to Western Europe to Latin America. And I think there's obviously national stories in each of these cases. And those are difficult to address in a single argument because each of these versions of anti-genderism needs to be understood in relation to the particular context in which it emerged. So I think that's some of the work that we're going to be seeing today. But there is also a global or transnational story, and one that has already produced some excellent scholarship, some of which was mentioned already, some of which is by people in this room. These are 3 examples of books that try to take to look at anti-genderism and its more global, as a more global or transnational or at least Eastern European or regional phenomenon. My angle in my research is a little bit different because I want to approach these debates from the perspective of intellectual history. So basically, I want to try to understand what were the intellectual networks that made this global circulation of ideas possible. When did the term gender ideology first emerge, and in what settings? And what did the various actors who use the term understand by it? How did this emphasis on gender and sexuality intersect with the rest of their political agendas? How were these extremely complex philosophical and academic texts, whether it be the writings of Judith Butler and Fausto Sterling, Joan Scott, etc., how were they translated and disseminated to wider audiences? So basically, how do we get to this image, right? This is from Brazil. Judith Butler's dream is to destroy your children's sexual identity. How does this person have access to the name and the corpus of Judith Butler, which, as we know, is not exactly easy texts? So who, if anyone, actually read these texts, and in what contexts? So this is what I want to talk today in the time that I have remaining. Most accounts of, let's see, I'm trying to go forward. Can you press the next slide? Yeah, thank you. So most accounts of anti-genderism trace its origins to the 1995 Beijing Women's Conference, and most point to the central role that the Vatican played in the elaboration and the diffusion of this discourse against gender. But what exactly happened in Beijing? Who were the main actors, and how did this idea of a gender ideology inspired by feminist theory appear in what was ultimately a convention of diplomats, state officials, and NGO activists, none of whom, at least you can tell from this picture, would appear at first glance to be particularly well-versed in the difficult works of Judith Butler? So how did gender enter this conversation, and what in particular triggered these Vatican representatives who attended the meetings? So before I get to this question, let me just give you a little bit of background on Beijing and on UN conferences more generally, because I think it's easier to understand the specificity of Beijing if we contextualize it in relation to previous UN initiatives pertaining to women's rights, but also in relation to other non-women specific UN conferences that took place in the first half of the 1990s. So women's equality and women's rights had been central to the UN from its inception, at least on paper. In its 1945 charter, the UN boldly reaffirmed the equal rights of men and women alongside the defense of fundamental human rights and the dignity of the human person. In 1946, the UN set up the Commission on the Status of Women, so CSW, to execute this task. For the first 2 decades of its existence, the CSW focused primarily on guaranteeing women universal access to political rights, namely the right to vote. By the late 1960s, however, the conversation around women's rights at the UN had shifted, and this is mainly due to 2 factors. First, a growing international feminist movement pointed to the many structural impediments that women continue to face in their daily lives, despite having acquired formal political rights. So this led the CSW in the 1960s to draft a document known as CEDAW, which was ultimately adopted in 1979. Now, the term gender did not officially appear in the CEDAW document, but one of its articles, Articles 5, did suggest that masculinity and femininity were social constructions, and it called on all state parties to fight against social prejudices and stereotypes. But the second main factor in the emergence of this new discourse around women was decolonization and the rise of recently independent nations that brought an array of new members to the UN, alongside with a whole new set of different concerns, including those of developing countries and feminists from the global South. So starting in basically the 1970s, the CSW organized a series of conferences. The first one in Mexico City in 1975. This also inaugurated International Women's Years. Copenhagen in 1980, Nairobi in 1985, and finally Beijing, which was the largest and in many ways the kind of most important accomplishment of CSW, Beijing in 1995. Prior to the 1980s, the word gender did not figure in any official UN documents. Instead, most of the conversations around women focused on questions of the status of women, the advancement of women, or the elimination of discrimination against women. So you see again the kind of rhetorical shift there. In Nairobi, however, the final document did include the term gender, understood in 2 different senses. So it talked about gender roles, which could be modified and made more flexible, but it also used it as a synonym of the 2 sexes. This was about kind of gender-specific statistics. Nairobi also witnessed the first discussion of the concept of gender mainstreaming, which has again been one of the kind of targets of this anti-genderism. Gender mainstreaming just means the idea of taking into account gender at all stages of policy making. But really nobody paid attention to the term gender then, or it wasn't seen as a controversial term. But gender also entered the vocabulary of international law through other UN conferences that were not specific to women, but that sought to rethink the international world order in the aftermath of the Cold War. So these were a series of UN-sponsored conferences. I hope you can see the name. The screen is a little small, but they included, so basically the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Population in Rio, the 1993 Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, ICPD, in Cairo, and the 1995 World Summit for Social Development in Copenhagen. So even though they weren't women-specific conferences, we began to see the term gender circulating more widely, especially in two domains that touched on many of these conferences: development and human rights. In the 1970s, the field of women in development, so WID, and women and development, WAD, had brought greater attention to women's economic participation. In the 1990s, however, gender and development, so GAD, criticized some of the essentialist notion of women that both WAD and WED seem to hold. GAD shifted the focus from women to gender as it considered the roles and expectations of both men and women and their differential power relationships within the household, as well as the role of class, race, and culture, and the role that they played in these mechanisms of exclusions of women. But it was really the conference in the field of human rights that the influence of feminist theory and international law was perhaps most visible, especially during the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. Although several feminist NGOs had been pushing for years the idea that human rights included the rights of women, the first UN planning document for Vienna barely mentioned women. This absence mobilized feminist activists, especially a group called the Global Campaign for Women's Human Rights, which attended Vienna, circulated a petition that was signed by lots of people, and lobbied for the recognition of human rights as women's rights. So this basically became the famous slogan that was then immortalized in Beijing in Hillary Clinton's speech, right? Women's rights are human rights. But this begins kind of brewing already in the early 1990s. This is a picture of Charlotte Bunch, who was at the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers and who was one of the many activists who really pushed for including women's rights as human rights. Their efforts in Vienna, so the efforts of these feminist groups in Vienna were extremely successful, and they generated an enormous global consensus that condemned and eventually criminalized gender-based violence. And I should say in parenthesis that this conference in Vienna has been the subject of really excellent critiques by scholars like Karen Engel and Elizabeth Bernstein, who have argued that this sudden attention to sexual violence from what they call a kind of carceral feminist perspective served to eclipse many of the issues that had been central to previous women's conferences. For example, its longstanding anti-militarism, the sex-positive position of many feminists involved with sex work and pornography, or third world feminist critiques of economic maldistribution, imperialism, and cultural essentialism. So it's been a conference that's been kind of written about a lot in recent years. But in my case, for my purposes here, I want to highlight two other ways in which Vienna was foundational. First, Vienna revealed how influential and how successful a carefully orchestrated feminist mobilization could be in shaping these discussions. Many of the feminist NGOs that attended the conference had better knowledge of the previous agreements and the texts that were being negotiated than most official delegates and diplomats. Furthermore, these feminists often used feminist theory, including the concept of gender, to shape the supposedly neutral language of the UN and consequently its policies. So that was a kind of, Vienna in some ways showed the fact that you could ultimately alter a document if you managed to get enough people mobilized on time. Second, Vienna illustrated with particular force the feminist insight according to which the personal is the political. Indeed, the feminist campaign to recognize gender-based violence relied on a series of carefully selected legal cases on topics ranging from domestic violence, rape and armed conflict, trafficking, compromise of bodily integrity, abuse of migrant women, and the political persecution of lesbians. Prior to 1993, no international instrument relevant to human rights had made any reference to sexual rights. And now, all of a sudden, it seemed like the private sphere was not seen as a refuge from the political, but actually as the original site of women's oppression. So you see again the kind of shift here. Women's bodies were suddenly on the table, and feminist activists had a new powerful language to talk about them. So this is the third part. It's called Feminist Politics at Cairo. The realization that gender and sexuality had grown increasingly central in international law became even more apparent the following year during the International Conference on Population and Development held in Cairo in September of 1994. So the two terms that were structuring the conference, population and development, had both been the targets of feminist critiques for years. If women's rights were indeed human rights, then development and population agendas needed to take into account the specific needs of women, rather than simply imposing a neo-Malthusian framework of fertility control, as had been the case in previous population conferences. So what this meant in practical terms was that health, sexuality, and reproduction were now viewed as essential components of development. As early as 1992, feminist activists drafted a Women's Declaration of Population Policies, which was endorsed by hundreds of organizations worldwide, and that demanded the respect of women's sexual and reproductive rights. At the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, the final document stressed the importance of reproductive health care and women's rights, and it also mentioned the possibility of women to have the right to limit their family size, quote, in keeping with their freedom, dignity, and personally held values. In 1993, during one of the preparatory sessions to the Cairo conference, Bella Abzoug urged you, so the Bella Abzoug, who was the co-founder of WIDO, a women's rights organization in the US, Bella Abzoug urged UN officials to include sexual orientation and also the right to have safe and voluntary abortions in the Cairo document. In January of 1994, at the Reproductive Health and Justice Conference also held in Rio, feminist activists succeeded in inscribing sexual and reproductive rights in the final document, which included at that point the term gender, and here gender was understood as a tool to examine relations of power. So I'm quoting from the document, "Sexuality and gender power relationships must be addressed as a central aspect of reproductive rights." Furthermore, the document introduced LGBT rights when it established a woman's right to express her sexuality with pleasure and without fear of abuse and risk of disease or discrimination on the basis of their sexual orientation or disability. So this was really kind of the first time that LGBT rights were kind of sneaking in, it's in some ways through the back door, but obviously not going. This was a kind of conscious decision for many feminist groups. As the Brazilian activist we've been talking about, Sonia Correa, put it, by the time Cairo came along, and I'm quoting her, "We had put sexual rights on the table and said, we want to talk about this." And indeed, sexual and reproductive rights occupied center stage at the ICPD conference. And this is what ultimately served as a wake-up call for many groups and institutions who had barely paid attention to the UN before, including the Vatican under the leadership of Pope John Paul II, who got directly involved in the conference in the months that led up to this conference. So here, I just wanted to show you this, and I hope you can read it, but it's a timeline of the 2 years that preceded the Beijing conference, and it's very fun to see, to kind of put together the Vatican's reaction to everything that's happening at the UN kind of step by step. So you see the first, so this is the 1993, the World Conference on Vienna, and then the several PrepComs. So the PrepComs are basically meetings that are organized for the delegates to kind of iron out all their differences, so that by the time their official conference opens, you have a document that everybody has agreed on. So you have the first PrepCom for Beijing in March of 1993. In March of that year, Anne Foster Sterling publishes an article in the New York Times called "What is Sex? What is Gender? The Five Sexes, Why Male and Female Are Not Enough." I'll return to this a little bit later in the talk. And then in May of 1993, you have the second PrepCom for Cairo. Okay, 1994, John Paul II creates the Pontifical Academy for the Social Sciences, and then at the same time, the Pontifical Academy for Life. These are these kinds of big think tanks that the Vatican creates to think about social sciences, but also questions of gender, population development, and all of these issues really kind of come back to the Vatican with a group of experts. Again, I'll return to this in a second. In February, in January of 1994, you have the Reproductive Health and Justice Conference in Rio that I was mentioning. So a month later, John Paul II writes a letter to the families to inaugurate what he calls the Year of the Families, where he reaffirms the centrality of children, the marital convent, and the complementarity of men and women in church doctrine. The following month, in March of 19th, in a letter addressed to all heads of states, to the heads of states of the whole world and to the UN Secretary General, the Pope referred to the Cairo document as a disturbing surprise. In it, he lamented its, quote, innovations on the level both of concepts and of wording. So already the Pope is kind of pointing to the problem of wording and language that has made its way into the Cairo document. Furthermore, the Pope deplored the draft's individualistic conception of sexuality, its suggestion that marriage was outmoded, and the promotion of what he called a lifestyle typical of certain fringes within developed societies, societies which are materially rich and secularized. So you see how these tropes that will return in Beijing, but we saw this morning too, right? Gender as a kind of imperialist imposition from the West onto places that are, you know, in the third world that don't have these issues. So already these tropes are already mobilized at that point. A few days later, in March 25th, the Pope pursued his attacks against the Cairo conference in front of his 125 ambassadors accredited to this Holy See. So he calls all the ambassadors to the Vatican, that he convenes them in Rome, and he basically attacks the conference. On April 6th, the Pope loudly condemned the population conference during a general audience in St. Peter's Square, and called for every family to resist, quote, the false sirens of the culture of death. And that month, the Pope also declared, basically he called for the church to build a Maginot line of defense against the Cairo conference, but one that was more one that was more effective than the original. So again, just memory, the Maginot line was the line that the French built to defend France against the Nazis during World War II. So again, drawing an analogy here between Cairo and Nazism, which is again a trope that we'll see come up, you know, as Agnieszka Graf was talking about this morning, but it's something that comes up again and again. Tensions continued to rise during the third and final session of the ICPD Preparatory Commission, which was held at the UN headquarters in New York from April 4th to April 22 in 1994. So at previous population conferences, there was the one especially that was kind of cited often was the one in 1984 in Mexico City. The UN had declared abortion an illegitimate means of population control, partly under heavy pressure from the American delegation, which at that point was sent by the Reagan administration. 10 years later, however, the discourse around abortion had changed, and not only within international law, but also within US politics, with the election of Bill Clinton in 1992 and the Supreme Court's upholding of Roe in Casey of that same year. It seems like decades ago, but it wasn't. So basically, many delegates, including the Europeans and the American delegates, refused to back down to the Vatican's pressure. A group that called itself Catholics for Choice, led by Francis Kissling, even began a campaign to remove the Vatican its status of permanent observer to the UN, a campaign that continued through Beijing. And then the Vatican kind of answers to them and says, well, they're not allowed to call themselves Catholic because we decide who's Catholic. And so it's like a kind of constant back and forth, but it attracts a lot of basically a lot of attention. Still, the Vatican continued. On April 24th, right after the end of the third and last PrepCom to Beijing, John Paul II proclaimed the beatification of two women. And so he chooses these two women, one of whom had died because she refused to have an abortion, and the other who had kept her marriage vows in a situation of domestic abuse. Both of them, however, were models, he declared, of Christian perfection. So if you see it kind of day by day, it's like kind of tit for tat, right? One thing leads to another. On September 1st, 1994, 4 days before the opening of the Cairo conference, the Vatican's press secretary, Joaquin Navarro-Valls, published an editorial in the Wall Street Journal in which he affirmed, quote, that the issue of human life and population undergirds all others. Like the Pope, he expressed serious concern for the Cairo documents' dubious use of words and language that imply only verbal agreement, but leave the door open for judicial or legislative interpretations later. So really a kind of awareness that the language of Cairo was going to open the door to all kinds of potential future calls. By that point, various evangelical groups had joined the Vatican in its opposition to the Cairo conference. By the time Beijing came along in September of 1995, these evangelical groups, alongside with the Vatican, had had a year to mobilize and mount their counterattack. As the Archbishop of New York, John O'Connor, put it, Beijing looked at first like it was going to be a simple repeat of Cairo. But instead, Beijing was a breaking point. It catalyzed these battles around sexuality and reproduction, and gender became the symptom of these fights. So, this is the first section. It's called the Beijing explosion. There's only 2 more sections left. So as I've been suggesting, the debate about gender exploded even months before Beijing opened, especially during the last PrepCom in New York City in the spring of 1995. So again, the point of these preparatory commissions were basically to discuss the document of the conference, which is called the Platform for Action, and usually delegates can kind of settle any conflict before the conference begins. The Beijing Platform for Action used the term gender 233 times. This was a conscious move, and immediately the Vatican and several of its allies objected. So this is one example. So here I have a couple of quotes. It's kind of, I wanted to show you the back and forth again. I hope you can read it, but I'll read it right now. It's a woman, a delegate from the Honduras delegation called Marta Lorena de Casco. And she's also the kind of founder of the Honduras Pro-Life Committee, had close ties to the Opus Dei, close ties to the Vatican. So she writes that during the last PrepCom, it became clear to her that radical feminists were seeking to control the conference. So I quote, "These debates showed me and many other delegates how deeply feminist ideology had permeated UN institutions. Nearly the whole document, which will be taken to Beijing, it is couched in language and relies on its assumption. With apparent innocuous terms such as gender, but also sexual rights, reproductive rights, maternal health, or safe sex, advocates are trying to impose a utopian vision of a new and sexless world in which lesbianism and homosexuality are on equal footing with marriage. Gender is, without doubt, the magic word, the pivot point of the Beijing conference." And then she says that basically, she says, "With others, I asked UN officials at the preparatory conference in New York what the word gender really meant. In their view, I learned gender did not have a definition and did not need one. However, even raising the question was considered so brazenly offensive and insulting that it was described as an act of sabotage against women and obviously against the conference itself." And so this delegate, for example, recounts that given that nobody was actually giving her a definition of gender, someone sent her to read, guess what, Judith Butler's 1990 book, Gender Trouble, instead, and she cites this. So I think it's interesting, again, to see how these names start to kind of filter in, right? And she cites the book, I mean, obviously in a very schematic and superficial way, but how it makes itself into the kind of discourse of several right-wing activists who are there. For a while, UN officials even considered removing the word gender altogether from the document, but several delegates refused. So this is Bella Abzoug, who I was mentioning before, right? So she was part of the US delegation, but also one of the co-founders of WIDO. So she says, "We will not be forced to back into biology as destiny concept that seeks to define, confine, and reduce women to their physical, sexual characteristics. The concept of gender is embedded in contemporary social, political, and legal discourse. It has been integrated into the contemporary political, social, and legal discourse. The meaning of the term gender has evolved as differentiated from the word sex to express the reality that women's and men's role are socially constructed and subject to change." So kind of giving a very standard definition of gender as a kind of historical construction. So there's kind of pushback. And you see, this is all happening before Beijing, right? To keep gender for its radical potential, and then on the other hand, to basically remove it. Finally, UN officials decided to set up a special committee to examine the definition of the word gender. And they came out with this report before the conference. And the report is hilarious because essentially, so this is, it's headed by this person, what's her name? Selma Sipala of Nambia. She's the chair. And basically, I'm not going to read it because I'm reading too much, but basically what she says is like the word gender means what we all think it means. You know, having considered the issue thoroughly, the contact group noted that the word gender has been commonly used and understood in its ordinary, generally accepted usage. But the whole point here is precisely that nobody could agree on what the accepted usage was. It's the ordinary, generally accepted usage was. So basically they're saying gender means what you think it means, but obviously nobody could agree on what it meant. Clearly, feminist groups had been using the term since the 1990s, and not necessarily, mostly not to refer to Judith Butler, but to interrogate the limit between private and public, and to insist on the fact that the intimate was also political. So I think it's important here to kind of see the two uses of gender. Gender used as by diplomats and state officials as a synonym of just women or sex, but then the also kind of conscious move from these feminist activists to politicize the term and make it precisely expandable so that they could put these new rights in it. Furthermore, they had turned to the language of human rights to talk about this issue, and this made it much more difficult to oppose their claims because, of course, everybody is for human rights. So when you couch something like, when you claim that abortion, for example, becomes a human right, then you have to find alternative ways to oppose it. So by the time Beijing opened in September of 1995, 60% of the platform for action, including every reference to gender, was placed in bracket at the demand of the Vatican and with the help of Honduras, Guatemala, Malta, and a few other states. This meant that the delegates had not been able to agree on the conference's main goals during the preparatory sessions. So the brackets are, like, again, the points that need to be negotiated during the conference itself. And just to give you a frame of reference, for the Cairo conference, only 12% of the document was in brackets. So that was already really controversial. So the fact that they couldn't agree on 60% of the document shows you how contentious it was going to be. And so something really interesting happens between the last PrepCom in April and the Beijing conference in September. So basically throughout the months of the summer, the debate around gender basically enters the mainstream through the Vatican once again, but also through various American right-wing organizations. And they are the ones who basically trace the dots between the use of gender at the UN in a kind of legal sphere to the feminist thinkers like Judith Butler. And so they do this very kind of consciously. Judith Butler and Foster Sterling, those are the two names that kind of come up most often. In particular, Anne Foster Sterling's book that she had published. So Anne Foster Sterling, who's a professor of biology at Brown, who published in 1992 this book called The Myths of Gender, Biological Theories About Women and Men. And in 1993, she publishes this article in the popular science magazine, The Sciences, in which she talked about the 5 sexes to describe a continuum between masculinity and femininity. So this idea of the 5 sexes comes up all the time, basically, in that summer before Beijing. But what the right means by the 5 sexes is male, female, homosexual, lesbian, and transsexual, right? And so, whereas, of course, Foster Sterling is not using it in those terms, but that's how it kind of gets diffused. So here's one example. I'm going to show you 2 examples of this, 3 actually. The first one is from the National Review of May 15, 1996. So it's basically a kind of column. So so I'll just read the quote. It says, they're describing what's happening in Beijing, and they say the players on one side, the UN Secretariat, the US, Canada, and the European Union, all fighting tooth and nail to redefine the term to encompass 5 genders: male, female, homosexual, or bisexual, and transsexual. The rationale: gender is a socially constructed and not related to sex or biology. On the other side, you have all the shocked delegates of Southern nations. Their rationale: God made Adam and Eve, and people really are men and women. The State Department's marching order: fight for change, 5 genders are better than 2. So you start to see again how these things start to circulate in kind of very wide-ranging right-wing publications, right, not read by specialists, and how all again of some of the tropes that we've been talking about all day, right, this idea of an imposition from the West, from elitist countries, the kind of classic tropes of populism are being mobilized here. And what's fascinating is basically that the State Department sends a memo to its delegation saying, really, we don't mean 5 sexes by gender, we mean two genders. So everybody's kind of taking on the debate as framed by the right, because the right reframes it, and then that becomes the kind of official discourse. Along similar lines, the Archbishop of Honduras, Oscar Rodriguez, very close to John Paul II and a specialist on education, who eventually again has a kind of big role in the diffusion of this anti-gender ideology, claims that Beijing was forcing people to accept 5 genders: masculine, feminine, lesbian, homosexual, and transsexual. So they differ on what the content is, but clearly, you know, they're kind of spreading this idea. Last example is Alan Carson, from the Rockford Institute, so a conservative think tank in the United States. And so he writes in his column of his newsletter, there are suspicions that gender means much more in the Beijing document, that the word expressed a role, a social construction, or a choice, not necessarily based in the differences between male and female. It was pointed out to the delegates that there is such a thing as gender feminism, often homosexual, which promotes the idea that gender is something fluid, changing, and related naturally, and not related naturally to being a man or a woman. Carlson also refers to Judith Butler, citing Gender Trouble and the Five Genders, and to a course at NYU called Reimagining Gender, which apparently he had the syllabus of. As he concluded, among possible consequences of introducing the term in the Beijing document without a precise definition is one that could justify changes in national legislation, for example, concerning marriage between persons of the same sex. So you see again how all of these are responding to particular anxieties. This is 1994, so there's obviously, it's before gay marriage in the US, but it's obviously already in the air, and these ideas are circulating. So gender gets used to oppose different things in different places. So the last section is called oh yes, and this is basically, this is the last, what's interesting is that the discussion of the five genders even makes it to the US Senate, because Republican senators Dan Coates, who was one of the authors of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and Jesse Helms, who you probably all know, basically tried to pass an amendment at the US Senate in a diplomatic act saying that the US delegation should make sure that gender means the two sexes, not five genders. So I'm quoting here Jesse Helms. Behind the scenes, it had become evident that the meaning of gender has been expanded to include not just male and female, but transsexual, bisexual, and homosexual. I wonder how many Americans consider gender to be relative. The definition of gender is sex, and that is male or female, period. And again, in its official communication with its delegation, the State Department continued to insist that, quote, no country in the UN is seeking to redefine the term gender to encompass five genders. So really kind of letting the right dictate the conversation here. So last bit, just to conclude, it's called Redefining Human Rights. By the time the Beijing conference actually opened at the end of August of 1995, everybody was ready for a fight. One of the Vatican memos insisted in all caps that it was, quote, imperative that every one of the five experienced negotiators of the Holy See attend the conference in September. And the person who was in charge of heading the Holy See delegation, who played a really important role in this whole process, was Mary Ann Glendon, the Harvard law professor who had been named by John Paul II head of the Pontifical Academy for the Social Sciences. So again, one of those new Vatican think tanks that played a big role in consolidating a kind of Catholic expertise on the social teachings of the church, but that included a kind of anti-genderism. Glendon was in many ways the perfect person for this mission. She was a woman, a faithful Catholic, and a professor at Harvard who described herself as politically homeless. So she keeps on saying that she's neither left nor right, because she's on the left for economic reasons, she's on the right for social issues. And most importantly, the recent author of this book, Rights Talk, in which she deplored the excessive individualism in modern American culture. So, you know, this idea that you would have an individual right to this, as opposed to having a kind of concern for the community and social responsibilities, again, very much in line with kind of the Catholic social teaching. This argument proved especially useful for the Vatican's, can you put the next slide if you don't mind? I don't know why it's not. So this argument proved especially useful for the Vatican's counterattack against feminists who had been framing reproductive health, contraception, abortion, but also LGBT rights as human rights. So the feminist camp was using human rights as a discourse, and Glendon in some ways was saying human rights is not enough. We can't have a human right to everything because it's going to lead to a kind of dissolution of the social, of the family, and of the community. So Glendon wrote in one of her memos, one should question the true intention behind the US, EU, and Western position to have ambiguous references to human rights and to avoid mentioning the word human dignity in this document. So the Vatican starts to push the notion of dignity, basically to oppose rights, and we can return to this, and the notion of equity to oppose equality. But these are terms, again, that were very important in the thought of kind of Catholic social thought for a long time, but especially in the thought of John Paul II, who wrote a lot about love, kind of heterosexual love as the foundation of the social, and also who kind of re-emphasized sexuality through his theology of the body. So he was kind of very pro-sexuality, but sexuality anchored in the marital heterosexual couple. you know, and John Paul was one of the big promoters of the idea of the complementarity of men and women, but also the kind of difference of men and women, right? That you couldn't have equality because women were ultimately mothers and men couldn't be mothers. So you see this in this kind of ultimate, this is the final statement of the Vatican in Beijing. So the Vatican keeps on writing these long memos saying that they're opposed to the platform for action. And so they finally, you know, the term gender stays in the document, but they write a statement saying the term gender is understood by the Holy See as grounded in biological sexual identity, male or female. Furthermore, the platform for action itself clearly uses the term both genders. The Holy See thus excluded dubious interpretations based on worldviews which assert that sexual identity can be adapted infinitely to suit new and different purposes. It also dissociates itself from a biological determinist notion that all roles and relations of the two sexes are fixed in a single static pattern. So this was kind of the line that John Paul takes throughout this whole 1990s, right? It's like we're not doing gender as cultural construction, but we're also not doing gender as biology or sex as biology, because we have this kind of personalist notion of complementarity that goes beyond that's ground. It's spiritual. It's a kind of spiritual complementarity, right? That is not, but it's not a biological reductionism. So we see basically the two main lines of argument here, right? Dignity against sexual and reproductive rights. So no right to an abortion, since dignity protects the personhood and of the fetus, right? And I'm sure we were talking about this last night with Marianne. I fear that this language, I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether this language comes back in the US, because it's certainly all over Europe right now. In France, the notion of dignity has done a lot of work to counter human rights. And this opposition to gender equality, and instead proposing the notion of equity, which implies difference, and specifically a different status for men and women, so women being mothers, but also a difference between homosexuality and heterosexuality. And again, as I said, you have to remember that all this is taking place before gay marriage is really on the table, but you do have several countries in Europe that have established legal recognitions for same-sex couples. So Spain, famously, Denmark, the Netherlands. So these conversations are in the air, and Beijing is really one of the first time where lesbian rights figure so explicitly on the UN agenda. So this is partly due to the work of LGBT activists and who push in Beijing for the inclusion of lesbian rights. So the right is completely obsessed, and I'm kind of obsessed with this too, the lesbian tent in Beijing, which is like at the NGO forum, and they and you know, one of the points of the lesbian activists was to include lesbian rights on the agenda, but the right just talks about this nonstop, right? And imagining what happens in the lesbian tent. So it's these international LGBT groups that were behind, so the famous statement also, lesbian rights are human rights. So you see, this is a poster of them. So lesbian free everyone, but put sexuality on the agenda at the World Conference. So essentially kind of saying like, we need to talk about this. So for example, James Dobson from Focus on the Family says in his newsletter that the workshop that, so this is funny, yeah, I was not going to include this because there's a lot, but this is what Dobson imagines the kinds of workshops are happening in the lesbian tent. I've had no confirmation of whether this is true or not, but I imagine it's not. But for example, lesbianism for the curious, talking about sperm donors, lesbian flirtation techniques, and my favorite, lesbians in the Baltics, new phenomenon of the 1990s. So there's a kind of like, so this again is in the kind of right in the focus of for the family newsletter. So you start to see how the myths of what's happening under this category of lesbian rights are all of these things. Anyway, you get the idea. And this is also how the lesbian tent becomes a kind of vector for the diffusion of these fantasies that all these lesbians are reading Judith Butler and Anne Foster Sterling in the lesbian tent. So you start to see again how these ideas start to circulate. Ultimately, sexual orientation did not figure in the platform for action, so the Vatican does win that battle. But you can already see here how sexual and reproductive rights, and hence gender, are depicted as imperialist notions from the global north, from rich and white nations, and how the language of sovereignty, national sovereignty, is constantly mobilized against genders, right? So this kind of as a way, the idea is to reaffirm national specificity, national sovereignty against these imperialist institutions and trying to impose the framework of sexual rights. So Cairo and Beijing constituted the first steps in the Vatican's campaign against gender. But the fight continued in many other vectors, notably through these big think tanks. I mean, they're not big, but they're important these think tanks that John Paul II had set up. So you see that he sets up the Pontifical Council of the Family, the Institute for the Study of Marriage and Family, and then the Pontifical Academy for the Social Sciences, and the last is the Pontifical Academy for Life. So Marianne Glendon, who you see on the picture here, is actually, as I said, heads the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences for 20 years. Obviously, they invite a series of experts to think about certain questions then these think tanks serve as a kind of, again, laboratories of diffusion, if you'd like, for this anti-gender campaign of the church. So I think Rodrigo will talk about this later today, but the lexicon, or he might, I don't know, but one of the big accomplishments of the Pontifical Council for the Family is to publish this lexicon on ambiguous and colloquial terms about family life and ethical questions, which included 700 and plus entries. It's about 900 pages, so a really fat book, with several paragraphs on gender, gender ideology, new definitions of gender, where all of these things come up again and again. This is the abbreviated version, which was published in France in 2011, so the year before the gay marriage debates, and it was widely circulating throughout the French gay marriage debates, and it shaped many of the arguments that were put forth by the opposition camp. So you start to see how, again, these activists on the street that have the kind of sign that I started with, saying no to gender, get some of these ideas of what gender might be, of what the theory of gender might be. So this is how you kind of get again to this global dissemination of ideas. One more example is Dale O'Leary, who is an important journalist and had a very important role in the kind of diffusion of this anti-gender agenda. So these are some of her tracts that she distributed in Beijing. So you see they're called Gender, the Destruction of Women. She distributes these in Beijing to the delegates who are there. And then you see this as a translation in Spanish. So there's a kind of, again, really interesting diffusion throughout the world. So you can see in some of the current anti-gender movements in Colombia, for example, some parts that come straight from Dale O'Leary's original tracts. And apparently Dale O'Leary is the one who offers Ratzinger a copy of her book, when Ratzinger was prefect for the doctrine of the faith. And, supposedly Marianne has worked on this, but other people in France, Odile Fillot has worked on this too. This is one of the ways in which Ratzinger kind of finds out about this idea of a gender ideology and then uses it in his own letters and encyclicals and tracts. So in 2004, he condemns the radical feminist use of gender, which obscures the difference of duality of the sexes and calls into question the family and its natural two-parent structure of mother and father. He also condemned this radical feminism for making homosexuality and heterosexuality virtually equivalent in a new model of polymorphous sexuality. And in 2008, once he's been elected Pope, Ratzinger calls for the creation of a movement of human ecology to defend not just the planet and the environment, but also heterosexuality, which is seen as in peril. And you see again how these terms go back to the activist ground. So this is, for example, a French group that called itself Écologie Humaine, human ecology, which you'd never know was against gay marriage originally, because gay marriage homosexual doesn't appear in their treaties, but it's all about the ecological struggle against gender and again the kind of idea of a holistic vision of man. And so again, you start to see how these diffusions kind of go from above to the grounds and back. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
I think we have.
Do I take my own questions, or how do we?
Sure. Yeah.
Do we want to group maybe one or two, or what do you think, Roy and Misha?
And just a quick note for the people online, you are very welcome to pose your questions in the Q&A, and we will read them out.
Yes, please. You had your hand up, yeah?
Hi, I don't know if this is working.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the paper. I really enjoyed it. And what struck me is that, I started thinking about like Thomas Hobbes here and and all of this kind of like contestation over definitions, right? Which is what he kind of says is like the function of sovereignty. Sovereignty comes to define certain terms, and that's how it is. Okay, so what we see here is there's some global crisis around defining gender or the family. So I was thinking, and in line with the last panel, is how can we think about global populism as kind of bringing about a crisis of sovereignty, not in the state, but in the family, right? Sovereignty of the family, boundaries around the family. And so I guess all of these, like what these presentations have in common is that they're pointing to an articulation of freedom from this side, right, that you call the right wing, but that articulation of freedom against the subjugation of global institutions, right, this imposition from top down, that sounds like very much like, you know, obviously the critique of the EU, all of that. But then how I guess thinking politically, how do we respond to those kinds of claims of freedom? And how do we think about, I mean, the question here is also what is it about queer sexuality, LGBT, that allows for these like cross-scalar political articulations, right? Because we're going from like the scale of the family here to the global, right? And I feel like there's something there about the threat, the coherent threat that this phenomena of gender LGBT causes, such that we can make these kinds of claims from the most intimate to the most kind of global.
Yeah, that's great. There's a lot in your question. No, I'm just going to thank you for the beginning, because I hadn't thought of, I mean, I teach Hobbes all the time, but I hadn't thought of Hobbes in this context. And I think that's spot on, because it's again, I mean, I love your parallel between the sovereignty of the family and the sovereignty of the collective, if you'd like, and the way in which language instability produces this kind of larger instability. But I think I've thought about the last part of the question. I mean, why is this language instability and this familial instability seen as the cause for the kind of anthropological demise of culture and more generally? I mean, I think, at least in the French case, I don't know if that argument works for every case in everywhere in the world, but I think there's this kind of fear of the domino effect, the kind of slippery slope, right? That if you give up on I mean, even on contraception, like think about humana vitae, right? That if you have a kind of complete dissociation between sexuality and reproduction, it essentially gives, you know, autonomy. Like it takes away any kind of notion of heteronomy in the political realm, and the idea is that, you know, men can kind of control everything. I mean, I think it makes the claims of an institution like the Catholic Church very difficult to uphold, you know, on the one hand. But I think it's also this idea of the slippery slope has to do with a real anxiety around reproduction. And we've talked about this already, like I don't mean biological reproduction, but almost cultural reproduction of children. Like the fear is sort of like, if you allow these non-traditional families to have children, whether it be, and it's not just gays, it's also like single people, right? Or if you allow a non-traditional model of the family to have children, what kind of gender norms will these children have? And again, how will that kind of perpetuate society? You know, so I think the slippery slope argument is it's even what Scalia said ages ago with Bowers, right? It was like, this is going to open the door to all this stuff. And in some ways it does, right? There is a kind of progression of rights that occurs once you decriminalize sodomy. Yeah. But it's, I mean, you know, I don't have a full answer, but I think that's why I think they also really intersect with questions of race and like sexuality and race. I didn't talk about this, but like in the French case, it's super interesting how the debates around gay marriage basically coincided with anti-Semitism was really important to it. So I think, again, Professor Graf talked about that in the Eastern Europe, but in France too, there was all these references to, again, the theory of gender being the fruit of lesbian Jewish Americans all the time, and the Jewishness comes up all the time. And then the racist campaign against Christiane Taubira, who was the Minister of Justice, who was Black, who was promoting the law. They published all kinds of horrible images of her cutting down family trees, etc. So race really comes into the, you know, because I think race and sexuality are the two axes in which social reproduction is imagined. So what kind of future children are we going to have? And I think, again, like in Europe, I don't think it's the case everywhere, but in France, I think it does link up with kind of fantasies about great replacement, right? Like who is going to replace us? right? Like who the Muslim, like it's like this, the fertility and the kind of, the obsession with the birth rate being white. Yes, please.
Everyone hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for the talk, because I think it's the most comprehensive talk on the foundations of this anti-gender movements I've seen so far. So related to the other question as well, I feel like we would be missing some element of the anti-gender movements right now, because Professor Graf talked about today in the previous talks, and you talked about like the historical background. But I think the extra hostility against gender and gender ideology in Europe actually is sort of grounded on the Istanbul Convention, which is the convention on preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence of the Council of Europe, because we see that countries like Bulgaria and Hungary didn't even ratify the convention, whereas Turkey recently withdrew from the convention. And this is used as frame for reshaping Europe and European politics of the populist governments like Viktor Orban, or like in Turkey, we see Erdogan using this. And this is also framed as EU actually going beyond its scope of the competences. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of France, where do you see the shift from Beijing to the convention? Like, what do you think happened in between that, so that it became such extra hostile attitude? Because like we know that the Istanbul Convention is legally binding, whereas the other UN conventions such as CEDAW are not that much. That's because they don't have the mechanisms such as the review. So I just was curious about France in that case.
Can you remind me when the Istanbul Convention is? What year?
It was signed in 2011. But I'm not sure when France ratified it. I'm sure that it's still ratified in France. They didn't.
Yeah. No, that's super. I mean, again, super interesting. I haven't figured out the full scope of this book, but I do want to, I mean, I focus on the UN here, but I think there would be a chapter to do on the EU institutions for the EU panic around gender, because that's, I think in many ways, what comes up much more often than the UN, at least in the French case, it's the, and certainly in Eastern Europe too. I mean, I was at a conference in Russia about this stuff, and it's really interesting the way that it's the Istanbul Convention and the European Parliament, and especially the human rights initiatives within the European Parliament that are portrayed as kind of like, again, an imposition of the EU onto Eastern Europe, or the people, right? So all of that language is there and present, and of course in the Russian case, the whole point, and we talked about this again this morning, is to kind of attract all of the Eastern European countries to Russia as the kind of defender of, true family values, as opposed to, and precisely leave the EU with all of its pro-gender ideology. So I think in Russia, that's definitely, I mean, there's really excellent work on this stuff. So I think that's definitely there. And you're right. In the European context, in the French context, this anti-EU language is constantly intersecting with anti-genderism, and they, it's constantly saying we need to leave the EU because, again, we're protecting national sovereignty, and national sovereignty is founded on heterosexuality. Again, I didn't show you these pictures, but in the French case, they're like the protesters against gay marriage are dressed themselves as Marianne with civil codes. If you're like a tourist going to France and you see them on the street, it would not be obvious that they're protesting gay marriage, right? There is no mentioning of gay anything. It's just the kind of mobilization of the defense of the Republic against this transnational activism.
I think in the interest of time, we'll collect the one question online and the question from Professor Case in the room.
Okay.
And while Daniel is moving, I'll read it out. This question comes from Dagmar Herzog.
Okay.
A counterfactual question, but what would have happened if there had not been the, we might say, tragically productive misunderstanding of Anne Fausto Sterling's essay on the 5 genders? What if that idea about 5 genders had never entered the international conversation? There were other right-wing worries about abortion and about the challenges to family stability caused by concern about domestic violence, as evidenced in the 2 beatifications. But somehow is the 5 versus 2 and the total misunderstanding that gay, lesbian, trans are genders that set the conservatives off the most. So that's one invitation for further reflection. And then Professor Case.
Yeah, I'm going to ride in on a couple of my hobby horses and basically say, you have started the timeline at least 10 and maybe 15 years too late. And I will point you to two of my hobby horses, one of which is the Ratzinger report from 1983, where without having the word gender, Joseph Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, names and connects together as part of a single dangerous ideology, feminism of the ordinary sort, gay rights, trans rights, the new reproductive technologies, both contraceptive and conceptive, and the new family law.
Mm-hmm.
And then also by 1983, actually earlier, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has made the word gender the word in laws in English in the United States, and I would argue in Beijing, which is a legal document, not a rhetorical document. And her view of gender is that it is a less dangerous word than sex because it doesn't cause people to think about obscene things. And also by 1983, the United States Supreme Court has endorsed her view and said that what needs to be outlawed is exactly what CEDAW says needs to be outlawed, which is, quote, fixed notions concerning the roles and abilities of males and females, unquote. So as you have known for years, I've been arguing that Judith Butler has very little to do with the concerns about the word gender in Beijing, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg has a whole lot to do with it.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you to both questions. I think in some way they both point to the question also of the chronology of the project and the kind of timeline. So I think I can maybe address both. I think, so I'm not, one caveat perhaps is that I don't think, my point is not to kind of provide this as a single, at the kind of ultimate origin of this anti-genderism. Obviously, there are links, as I said, as I started this talk, each national story has to be grounded within its own context. I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm very attuned to these differences. And I'm not a U.S. historian, but I've been reading much more about the U.S. case, and it's clear that debates around, for example, the ERA, anti-abortion, are really kind of key in configuring this particular shape that the debates took. So I think Dagmar's question that how does this relate to previous concerns? Very much so. I think it's there's a continuity there. What I'm interested in, of course, is this new language. So the concerns might be the same, but the term gender coming from this highly complex vocabulary, rhetoric, that I think is new. And that I do think emerges in the 1990s. So this links me to Marianne's question, which I think, obviously, I think the role of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in this is very important. And I think you're, again, completely right to kind of point to Ratzinger's own formation. I think Ratzinger and John Paul too. I mean, I put this slide of John Paul, but both of them have been thinking about sexuality for decades. I mean, as I said, John Paul, I read John Paul's intervention, really philosophical intervention, as a personalist, Catholic who basically makes heterosexual complementarity the foundation of the social, for reasons that have to do, again, with Eastern European history of this particular, of the 80s, anti-totalitarianism, the Cold War, etc. So I think, so both Ratzinger and John Paul, and I want to do that in the work, is kind of contextualize their this new anti-genderism with their long-term trajectory of their own thoughts, and also the church's own kind of evolution on sexuality since Vatican II, through Humana Vitae and all that stuff. So I think all of that is a very important context. I think we may defer on this question of Judith Butler, because so Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as you well know, uses the term gender because she says that her clerks tells her at some point, every time you say sex, the judges freak out, so you better say gender. So she uses it basically as a synonym of sex. That's how it's used legally. As I said in the beginning of the UN, that's how it's used legally, as kind of either sex or women. And most people who say gender mean women. They don't mean feminist theory, or they mean sex. But yet, as I've tried to show here, there is all this evidence of these difficult texts kind of coming in. And so the question is, again, why these texts, right? Why would you go to these complicated cases? And Ruth Bader Ginsburg's name is not the one that comes up in Beijing. The name that comes up are Anne Fausto Sterling, and at the same time, this is the moment, of course, of the development of gender studies, because if there is no such thing as the theory of gender, there are gender studies, and those are developing in the early 1990s. So again, one of the timeline, in my big timeline for the book, you also have the kind of publication of Gender Trouble and Fausto Sterling, Joan Scott, like all of this is happening side by side. So if you see this one by one, and what's interesting to me is, again, the diffusion of these ideas and how these texts that are extremely complicated make their way to the Vatican and to the women in Brazil with a sign, right? So again, I'm not saying it's obviously not a faithful reading. It's obviously not, it's obviously a straw man, a symptomatic reading, et cetera, whatever you'd like. But why do they need that instead of using old school homophobia or, the Bible or all the kind of tradition, morality, nature, the kind of repertoire that you had accessible to talk about some of the same issues precisely that were available before? Why this shift to this highly complex philosophical, psychoanalytic, theory to think about this? And that's for me the interesting question right now. Yes.
Thank you so much. So many questions, but I'm going to ask a different kind of prequel. I don't remember the dates exactly, Camille, but it strikes me that before the word gender is used, previously, at least by 1980, there is a lot of pushback from, for example, Middle East representatives, right, on the destruction of culture and family and marriage, right? So I'm curious about how that, and then on the other hand, the US, among other things, wants to insist on lesbian rights, which they also see as a violation of culture. So I'm interested in how that's part of your genealogy. Yeah. And the second thing to move forward, I think, to me, it's most useful just in looking at the Indian trajectory, to look at the documents that shape the thing that the diplomats take forward, right? And then also like the effects it has when they come back, like how NGOs begin to take things up or not. So I'm just very interested in what you think the recursive effects were, for example, in the US, on how we begin to read, we begin to see Fausto Sterling and Judith Butler reimagined out of that. In
the US, you mean? Yeah. So I think on the first question, the Middle East connection, yes, I didn't mention this, but it's very important. And you see it in the documents too, like Sudan, Iran, sort of take, and this is what someone was mentioning before, the Baptist Burqa Alliance, right? So this, I think his name is Bob Clifford, I think, who wrote that, or Clifford Bob, who wrote that book about the kind. And then also the book I was mentioning, the Global Human Rights, D.D. Huss. So there's they all kind of point to these alliances between, kind of more fundamentalist vision of sexual complementarity. The Sudanese government, in the videos I've seen, are the ones who are really against the idea of lesbian rights. And then all of these countries write objections, right, to at the end of the Platform for Action, and all of them say, we don't even have the word gender in our language. But it's interesting because even the French don't have the word gender in their language. I mean, the French term at that point is, rapports sociaux des sexes. Like, so they have to write a whole report also saying, like, we don't really use that term, but at the same time, we understand that it's an important. So the EU is pushing for the term. So and so there's all these, and this is why also one of the arguments of the Vatican is that it's a question of translation, that they're trying to impose a new language on cultures that don't even have the language to. But your second question about Judith Butler was kind of, how does it get back to, yeah, I mean, what's fascinating for me is I started this in the French context, and what was really interesting to me was that, again, that gender theory, of course, was seen as an American imposition, whereas Judith Butler's book is so premised on French theory. So that was already a kind of funny circulation of ideas, because there's all this interesting language of national specificity in terms of the scholarship. Like there's this philosopher, so they'll say things like, those are all American feminists, even though they're all using Michel Foucault and Althusser and people who are French, Monique Wittig, Simone de Beauvoir, but then basically, like, there's a kind of denationalization of the author. So one my favorite example is one of the anti-gender books in France talks about Monica Wittig, of course her name is Monique, not Monica, but like trying to kind of exoticize her as being like she can't be French, right? So let's call her Monica. So there's, again, the circulation of all of these ideas is very interesting, and the national specificity of it.
So since there's a little bit more time, I'll pose the 3 questions that are currently active online, paraphrasing a little bit. So I apologize to the question askers if I overlook some of the nuance. The first question starts with a recognition that right-wing activists today are focusing their rhetoric on trans rights because they considered it advantageous to treat a relatively small group of marginalized people instead of women, for example, or to target a relatively small group of marginalized people instead of all women. And this question asker poses the question, were there feminists focusing so strongly on cis heterosexual women that they cooperated with the Vatican in the 1990s? The second question is about sort of the function of liberal internationalism. How do we think about the politics of how center-left or right-wing interests ceded ground to more extreme right-wing positions? And that even though these populist movements disavow liberal international institutions, they also use them, and in some respects very conventionally. And then the final question has a couple of nested questions within it, asking about the context of the Beijing conference in terms of China and US relations, and also asking about the US government's role and Hillary Clinton's adoption of women's rights as human rights symbolically. So your reflections on these individually or maybe all together.
Okay, let me see if I can hold it together. The last, I'll start with the last one because that's in some ways easier. The context of the Beijing, it's a huge drama, and there's a lot of press about this because obviously there's a lot of pressure on everybody to talk about China's violation of human rights as the conference is happening. They've just imprisoned Harry Wu at the time, or released him, I forget, but there's this whole campaign about his political, the fact that he's a political prisoner. So that's very kind of on the table. And China is also, I should say, also pretty. I mean, it's early on, so it's still not a closed country, but it's not what it is today. So there's all these stories from the activists at the time that I don't know again how much of this is true, but I've heard it from a couple of people that the Chinese police had a series of sheets so that if the women decide to go naked on the streets, they could cover them up. Kind of feminist gone wild. So there was this kind of a lot of a certain anxiety about holding this women's conference there at the time. The American delegation is interesting because, again, it's a shift from other delegations. Like the other population conferences, I said, were much more were basically constituted by the Reagan administration. So abortion there was a kind of gag order on any abortion funding for a long time. Now in Beijing, as I said, the scene has kind of changed, and so the person heading the committee is Timothy Worth, and he's I forget what he is, global undersecretary, something like that under Clinton, and they have people like Bella Abzug in the they're not all lefty, but they do have a couple of pretty liberal people in their delegation, and of course, and some of you might still remember the drama around Hillary Clinton going to that convention and all the kinds of attacks she got here by the Republicans because she was kind of going as first lady and saying that women's rights were human rights and all of these things. But so Madeleine Albright were there. So the U.S. delegation was pushing for a pretty open platform, but the ones who I think, from what I've read the testimonies, that the EU was really the one who was the committee that was pushing for really kind of explicit, the more kind of progressive reproductive rights and sexual rights. It was headed by Spain at the time, and I think this had to do also with kind of the evolution of Spanish politics. So the Socialist Party in Spain had a real left in the 1990s, and they were pushing for things like domestic partnership laws, et cetera, et cetera. So they were the ones who were kind of pushing more for the kind of more what's seen as more extreme version of these rights. The question of trans rights, it doesn't come up in Beijing. Very little. It comes up, but it's still really centered on abortion. And abortion and LGBT rights. I think the question of gay marriage is really haunting these discussions. And I think that's why all of the memos keep on saying, like, if we allow this, it'll open the door to gay marriage, even though obviously nobody in Beijing is pushing for gay marriage. But I think it's already in the conversations and kind of political conversations enough that it's making people very anxious. And it makes sense. It's like around what DOMA is 1994, right? Or something. It's around that. It's 92. I forget when DOMA is, but it's around those early years. So clearly there's kind of an anxiety about this. And finally, the function of liberal internationalism. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say. I think there's this is when I think again, there's a kind of longer history of this. And I know that some Americanist historians have been talking about the kind of mistrust of the right of liberal internationalism for a long time. And I want to inscribe this within that kind of longer trajectory. It's not just obviously Beijing. It doesn't emerge as a new thing. It's inscribed in a kind of protectionism that's been there for a long time in all of the countries. But I think, again, it takes a particularly new twist, because then in the anti-genderist propaganda that we see today, the UN comes up all the time. So the picture I showed of Brazil, right, of the Judith Butler protests in Brazil that were kind of got a lot of attention. They burned an effigy of her on the streets, and there's a big UN flag sprinkled with blood. So very much this idea that the UN and Judith Butler are one, right? And that it's all a kind of imposition of gender imperialism. I think if there's no other questions, I can say thank you to all, and thank you.